Welcome. I'm really glad you're here because what we're about to dive into could completely change the way you think about life, death, and everything in between. For so long, we've been conditioned to believe certain things, especially when it comes to death. And much of what we've been taught might be entirely wrong. Imagine just for a moment that death isn't the end we've all been led to believe. What if it's not some final moment of emptiness or nothingness, but a profound, transformative shift into something entirely new? This idea has been hidden from us for a long time, deliberately kept in the shadows because of how dangerous it could be to the powers that control us. The commonly accepted view of death is that it marks the absolute end of life, a final, irreversible transition into oblivion. This view, however, might be completely misguided. According to ancient wisdom, death is not an end at all, but rather a journey, a process, and even a choice. The Tibetans and Egyptians, two of the world's oldest and most sophisticated civilizations, had a very different understanding of death. What they taught suggests that death is not something to fear, but something to be understood and even mastered. And this secret understanding, passed down through hidden manuscripts and teachings, could be the key to transcending the very cycle of life and death itself. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Bardo, is not just a religious book as many have thought. It's much more than that. It's a manual, a guidebook designed to help us navigate the afterlife and break free from the cycle of rebirth. According to the teachings found within this ancient text, death isn't a final chapter. It's simply a transition into a series of intermediary states called the Bardos, where reality becomes malleable and is shaped by our own perceptions. The teachings reveal that we have the ability to consciously navigate this transition and, if we are aware enough, to free ourselves from the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. At the moment of death, when the awareness separates from the body, there is a brief window of clarity, a moment when we can realize that the separation between ourself and the world around us is an illusion. Unfortunately, this opportunity is missed by most people because they are pulled into the second stage of the Bardo, a realm dominated by karmic projections. This is the stage where our fears, attachments, and unresolved desires come into play, shaping the experience and often trapping us in the cycle of rebirth. But if we can awaken to the truth, if we can see through these illusions, we can break free. In the Bardo, we encounter visions, some of which are terrifying. Demons, wrathful gods, and dark figures may appear, but these are not external threats. Rather, they are projections of our own mind, created by our attachments and fears. The key to freedom is understanding that these entities are not real. They are manifestations of our own spirit. If we respond to these experiences with fear, however, we will be caught in the cycle again. But those who recognize the illusions for what they are, the ones who see that form and appearance are mere projections, are the ones who transcend the cycle. They are the ones who can choose whether or not to be reborn, or whether to transcend reincarnation entirely. This concept of choosing one's next incarnation or rejecting the idea of reincarnation altogether is perhaps the most revolutionary and dangerous aspect of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Imagine for a moment if everyone knew that death wasn't something to fear. What if we knew we could control it, that we didn't have to come back again and again to suffer? How would that change our world? The fear of death has always been used to control us. The powerful understand that if people stop fearing death, they stop being easily controlled. But if everyone knew this truth, if they understood that death is simply a process to be navigated, it would challenge the very foundation of power and control in the world. What's even more unsettling is that the Tibetans weren't the only ones to hold these teachings. The ancient Egyptians, for example, believed that death was not the end of life, but a rite of passage, a journey into the afterlife. Their understanding of death is outlined in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a guide for the soul to navigate the afterlife. This book reveals that, just like the Tibetan teachings, death is a process that must be mastered. It's not just about surviving the afterlife. It's about controlling what happens after death, deciding whether the soul will rise to a higher plane or be sent back into the cycle of reincarnation. The Egyptian Book of the Dead describes various trials that the soul must go through after death, including judgment, illusion, and trial. One of the most famous parts of this process is the weighing of the heart. The soul stands before Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and its heart is placed on a scale, weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which represents truth. If the heart is too heavy with sin and attachment, the soul is sent back into the cycle of reincarnation. However, if the heart is light, free from attachment, the soul is able to enter the afterlife. This is remarkably similar to the teachings in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where attachment and fear lead to rebirth, but freedom from attachment allows transcendence. What does this tell us? Both the Tibetan and Egyptian traditions teach us that death is not an end. It's a journey. It's a test, a transition, and an opportunity to free oneself from the cycle of reincarnation. The ancient Egyptians and Tibetans weren't just preparing people for death, they were preparing them for liberation. They were showing their followers how to transcend the suffering of the physical world by mastering death. But why has this knowledge been hidden from the public? Why have we been conditioned to view death as an end, as something to fear and avoid? It seems that the knowledge of death's true nature has been deliberately concealed by those in power. The ancient Egyptians, for example, had priests and initiates who were trained in these mysteries of death. They knew how to navigate the afterlife, how to transcend the cycle of rebirth. The pharaohs, too, were seen as enlightened beings privy to this knowledge. The pyramids and tombs were not just burial sites. They were gateways designed to help the soul transition into the afterlife. But this knowledge wasn't available to everyone. It was reserved for the elite, for those in power to maintain control. Similar teachings can be found in other ancient cultures too. The Greeks, through the Eleusinian mysteries, believed in a symbolic death and rebirth process that granted them access to hidden knowledge. The Gnostics, who lived around the same time, believed that the physical world was a prison for the soul, and the only way to escape was through the acquisition of secret knowledge. These teachings all point to one thing: death is not the end, but a transition. And the key to transcending death is hidden knowledge. So why has this knowledge been hidden from us? Why have we been taught to fear death, to see it as an unchangeable fate? What if the elites of past civilizations never truly lost this knowledge? What if it has been passed down, safeguarded and concealed while the rest of the world was fed a false narrative? The more we explore these ancient texts and teachings, the more we begin to see a pattern. Death has always been more than just an end. It has always been a process to be understood, navigated, and ultimately transcended. This is why we created the Inside Academy, a free newsletter where we share information that is too controversial to be discussed openly. If you sign up, you'll get access to powerful resources like The Kybalion, a book that reveals the hidden principles of the universe. But that's just the beginning. We'll go deeper, exploring ancient teachings, offering insights into how these traditions view death, and challenging everything you think you know about life and the afterlife. The truth is out there, hidden in plain sight. It's time for us to reclaim this knowledge and break free from the cycle of fear and control. Imagine a world where death no longer holds power over us, where we can choose our own fate, free from the chains of reincarnation. That world is possible, and it starts with understanding the truth about death and what lies beyond. Are you ready to explore that truth with us? If death is something that we have the ability to influence, then it must be under the control of someone. In addition, if we do not comprehend the reality of the situation, we are nothing more than puppets in a system that is far older than we could have ever imagined. Now, this is only the beginning of things, because the more we progress, the more we come to understand that the knowledge of death is not only concerned with what occurs after death, but also it is concerned with those who are in possession of the keys. As will become clear in the next section, this information has not been lost. It has been buried, concealed in occult texts, grimoires from the Middle Ages, and rituals performed by a select few individuals who were not permitted to see it. In the event that the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Egyptian Book of the Dead were intended to serve as guides for souls beyond death, what about the other works that discuss the subject? In addition, what about the grimoires of prohibited manuscripts, which are occult writings that discuss rituals that are designed to exert influence over the afterlife proper? As we continue to investigate, we are coming to the realization that this information has not been lost. It had been concealed, locked up, and in some instances, it had been deleted on purpose. This is due to the fact that the truth about death is not just about what occurs after death, but also about people who are in positions of authority. Over the course of human history, there have been many attempts made by secret groups, mystics, and dishonest intellectuals to break through the barrier that divides life and death. Someone made an attempt to trick it. The others made an effort to comprehend it. However, they had a conviction that death could be controlled, which was the only thing they had in common. Their teachings were prohibited, their books were destroyed, and their names were obliterated from the annals of history because of this same reason. As an example, consider the Picatrix, which is an old grimoire that discusses astral magic. It has been reported to contain formulae that may be used to communicate with ghosts and go to worlds that are beyond the physical. But the book was more than just a magic book. It was also a guide for altering reality itself, implying that the line between life and death was not a set one, but rather a fluid one. Why was it kept a secret? Mainly due to the fact that it implied that human awareness was not constrained by the rules that we were taught to accept. Additionally, there is the Book of Abramelin, which is an esoteric text that details a secret initiation into higher knowledge. This initiation requires months of self-purification, seclusion, and a last step that is very important. Making touch with one's holy guardian angel is required, but here is when things start to get troublesome. Before the initiate is able to achieve enlightenment, the text cautions that he will be subjected to a succession of deceptions from shadow creatures, demonic entities, and illusions that are aimed to force him into servitude. This closely echoes the teachings that are found in the Book of the Tibetan Dead, which warns that those individuals who do not identify the illusions of the lake beyond will be dragged into the cycle of reincarnation. However, Lars Moriendi, also known as The Art of Dying, is a medieval Christian treatise that was published in 1415 and is considered to be one of the most unsettling texts ever written on death. At first look, it seems to be straightforward guidance for those who are nearing the end of their lives, instructions on how to get the soul ready for paradise. On the other hand, it includes a cautionary note about the deceit that often takes place at the moment of death. There are descriptions of beings who come before the dying, attempting to entice them into accepting their fate by providing them with a false sense of peace. And what if they were not only analogies for religious concepts? And if these messages were trying to warn us that something is occurring that we are not meant to grasp, despite the fact that we are on the verge of being killed? There are innumerable grimoires that all have the same theme. Death is not what it seems to be. There are forces that are waiting behind the curtain, and those who do not identify the illusions run the danger of being consumed by a spiral that is greater than themselves. Furthermore, the most unsettling aspect is that these sentences were not mysterious in any way. In the past, they were extensively read and well known, but then they were methodically removed from circulation, labeled as heresy, and buried deep inside the archives of obscure organizations. Each and every one of the Vatican's manuscripts, which number in the thousands of pages, have never been made available to the general public. Bibles in their whole were destroyed in the guise of safeguarding mankind from the dissemination of prohibited information. But who made the decision on which ones were not allowed? When it came to death, who decided which information we were permitted to know? An issue of control is also involved, in addition to the subject of history. If death is a process that we are able to comprehend, and if there are practices, teachings, and rituals that enable us to go through it without fear, then why are we taught to be afraid of it? If death is something that should be avoided at all costs in our day and age, what is the reason behind this? What could possibly be more scary than a transition? The explanation is straightforward, because a population that is terrified of dying is a population that is easy to manage. People who sought the truth, however, were shunned, punished, or even worse. These individuals were the ones who read the books that were banned, participated in the rituals that were secret, and knew what death really was. Because as soon as you stop being afraid of dying, you are no longer bound to the system that is dependent on your fear. And it is precisely at this point that the withholding of information becomes indisputable. Because if these documents were destroyed, concealed, and obliterated, what was it that they were attempting to keep us from finding out? At what point did the truth become so dangerous that it had to be buried? The solution might be found inside the individuals who did away with it, as a result of the fact that the concealment of this information was not haphazard but rather methodical, for the purpose of preventing this knowledge from slipping into the hands of the general populace. Whole institutions were established. That being said, as we shall see in the next section, the most powerful organizations in the history of the world were founded on a conscious attempt to make sure that you never learned the truth about death. The early Christian church, which depended on the dread of death to keep power, was directly threatened by this thought, which was not only harmful, but also constituted a direct challenge to the early Christian church. All of the Gnostics were eradicated, and their writings were burned in a methodical manner. What remained of their teachings was discovered centuries later in caverns concealed in the desert. These caves were known as the Library of Nag Hammadi, and they contained a collection of parchment that called to mind a secret spiritual conflict that was going place beyond death. It was not simply the Gnostics who were affected. Another group of spiritual rebels in medieval France, known as the Cathars, had ideas that were comparable to these. In addition, they held the belief that reincarnation was a cycle that was designed to maintain humans in a state of servitude. They were slaughtered in one of the earliest large-scale religious genocides in the history of the world because they held the view that death is a transition rather than an end. This belief made them threatening to the Catholic Church, which is why they were eradicated. In the 13th century, the Albigensian Crusade was initiated with the express purpose of eradicating them specifically. It was not for political reasons or for money that a whole community was eradicated. Rather, it was because the ruling order deemed their conception of death to be too hazardous. However, in spite of the methodical eradication of these teachings, remnants have remained. These fragments have not only been preserved in secret manuscripts, but they have also been preserved in the concealed doctrines of secret organizations that are still in existence today. Both the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, as well as some Kabbalistic lineages, may trace their origins back to these ancient teachings on the manipulation of death. For instance, Freemasons organize their initiations around the concept of death and the metaphorical rebirth that follows. You are more likely to be exposed to the concept that death is an illusion and that the only people who can genuinely be free are those who have a complete understanding of it as you go through the hierarchy. Before and after death, the Rosicrucians thought that conquering the spirit was the way to escape the physical world. They felt that this was the secret to surviving. Kabbalah, on the other hand, is a mystical section of Jewish tradition that describes the hereafter not as a location of ultimate judgment, but rather as a landscape of choice. Kabbalah describes the afterlife as a region in which the soul must traverse deceit in order to gain genuine enlightenment. In light of this, the issue that remains is, if these concepts were not true, then why were they eradicated with such force? It is difficult to understand why the most powerful organizations in history would go to such great pains to conceal them if they were not true, as a result of the fact that these concepts not only contradict religious teaching, but they also call into question the entire foundation upon which control is based. It is suggested by them that the dread of death, which is the ultimate terror, is not required. The implication is that you do not need the assistance of kings, priests, or saviors in order to be prepared for the hereafter. All you need to do is know. On the other hand, this information has been deliberately suppressed, and we can only question who stands to gain from maintaining mankind in a state of ignorance. When people are fearful of those who are waiting for them beyond the curtain, when they cling tightly to material existence, and when they are afraid of death, who gains from a world where people are afraid of death? Not only is the solution located in the past, but it is also present at this very moment. The management of death is still an issue that is significant in the present day, since it is not simply about the past. On the other hand, rather than destroying books and organizing religious crusades, it has adopted a new pattern, one that is much more successful. After gaining an understanding of how it operates, you will see that the suppression of the knowledge of death has never been abandoned. Rather, it has only progressed with time. What are they actually trying to tell us if all of these old manuscripts, these hidden rites, and these forgotten grimoires all point to the same reality, which is that death is not what we believe it is? What was the information that was deemed to be so dangerous and so subversive that it had to be buried, destroyed, and removed from the record of what had happened? Understanding that death is only another level of awareness allows one to transcend fear, sorrow, and even the cycle of reincarnation. The solution is straightforward. Death is simply another condition of consciousness. All of these texts, including the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Gnostic scriptures, grimoires, and the occult, all point to the same conclusion. Death is a transition, not an end. The condition of one's mind is the single factor that may influence the next step that one takes and the level of consciousness that one has at that particular instant. Unprepared minds tend to cling to the things they already know. The entity that appears at the threshold, as well as delusions and karmic projections, are things that it is afraid of. Furthermore, when one is overcome with terror, they are transported to a different body, a different existence, and still another cycle of forgetting. Yes, it is the snare. However, those who are able to acknowledge death for what it really is are able to liberate themselves. Through his explanation, Bardo Toll reveals that the enlightened mind has the ability to select its future life or to transcend it totally. According to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the afterlife is a succession of doors and challenges, but those who are able to pass through them without any harm are those who are aware of the appropriate words and have the appropriate awareness. At the moment of death, souls are confronted with false lights from deceptive entities designed to lure them into the physical world, the Gnostics thought. These false lights are designed at the moment of death. The cycle may be broken, however, if you are able to see the lie. This is the most perilous information that can be obtained. What kind of power would be lost by governments, churches, and companies if people were aware that death is not the end, and if they realized that fear is the only thing that holds them captive? In the event that individuals were to abandon their fear of death, they would no longer be subject to control. They would no longer be frightened to live their lives according to their own terms, to reject the institutions that need their compliance, or to challenge the powers that thrive on their acquiescence. These teachings have been removed from existence for this reason. It is for this reason that everyone who attempted to expose them has been labeled as heretical, insane, or even worse. For the reason that the instant you cease being afraid of dying, you are no longer constrained by the laws that govern this world. On the other hand, here is where things get even more unsettling. If this information was previously widely known, if people from all over the world, including the Egyptians, Tibetans, Gnostics, and medieval mystics, were aware of it, then why did it go extinct? Why has mankind as a whole failed to remember the truth that is the most significant of all lies? Some people believe that it was not only forgotten, but that it was also taken and concealed by individuals who were aware of its power. Even while the general population was indoctrinated to be afraid of death, some organizations continued to investigate it, to take advantage of it, and to use it as a way to gain power. And if that is the case, what exactly has been concealed from us? Because if the myth that death is the end is the biggest lie that has ever been told, then the greatest secret that has ever been hidden is the truth about what happens to us after we pass away. Furthermore, if we are interested in regaining this information, we must begin by calling into question all that we have been taught. Mainly due to the fact that once you comprehend death, you comprehend something even more significant. You comprehend the means by which you may retake control, not just in the hereafter, but also in this actual life. Furthermore, the information is the thing that they are most afraid of. This information was never lost. Rather, it was stolen, concealed in plain sight, distributed throughout civilizations, religions, mystery schools, and encoded in manuscripts that only initiates were intended to read. The further you go, the more evident it becomes that this knowledge was never lost. Throughout the course of history, from continent to continent, and from belief system to belief system, the same essential fact about death has been repeatedly seen. In spite of this, it has been methodically removed from the comprehension of the general public. How come? For the reason that if individuals were to comprehend the actual nature of death, it would be impossible to exert any control over it. It is important to pay attention to the patterns. The Tibetan Book of the Dead explains a series of illusions that are designed to trick the soul after death and bring it back into the cycle of reincarnation. There are deceiving entities known as archontic powers, which feed on human pain and inspire souls to be reincarnated. The Gnostics cautioned about these archontic forces. In the Egyptian belief system, the only way to navigate the hereafter was via the voice of one's conscience. They thought that one might avoid being judged by understanding the appropriate words and vibrations. Then there are the mysteries surrounding Eleusis, which was one of the most potent and secretive rituals that was performed in ancient Greece. Each year, a selection of initiates is chosen at random and then subjected to an experiment that simulates death itself. Those few individuals who were able to successfully finish the ceremony never disclosed what they had seen, but those who emerged from it said that they no longer had a fear of death. To what extent were they made aware? Is there anything so deep that it completely eradicated the dread of dying altogether? Not to be outdone, there are also the Orphic cults, which are yet another old enigmatic religion that had ideas that were almost comparable. They believed that the soul was hemmed in by a cycle of reincarnation, and that the only way for it to break free was via the acquisition of knowledge and the preparation of oneself. Instructions for traversing the afterlife were included inside their secret scriptures, which were buried by initiates. The concept that death is but another condition of life, that awareness is the key, and that the soul must fight the forces that want to draw it back into the physical world is a motif that can be found in many religions, including Buddhism and Hinduism. There is no coincidence about this. This is a pattern that is repeated indefinitely, buried in many societies and encoded in various writings. Nonetheless, they all lead to the same truth. Death is not an end, but rather a test. Nevertheless, this is the point at which things get even more unsettling. This information was taken from the mind of the general population at some point in time throughout history. It was rewritten. Corrupt faiths that had previously taught that the soul had the power to survive death became religions of obedience, which required faith rather than intellect. Dogma took the role of spirituality in society. Once seen as a prison from which one may escape, the cycle of reincarnation has evolved into a process that is considered to be natural or even desired. Moreover, everyone who raised objections to this modification was silenced. Why would anything like this take place? Why would those in power conspire to keep humanity ignorant of its own inherent spiritual potential? This is not just a question about abstract philosophies. It is a fundamental inquiry into the systems that govern our lives, our beliefs, and our understanding of the world. If we were to peel back the layers of deception that have been carefully constructed over centuries, we would discover a profound truth. The control over death and the nature of existence has been hidden from the masses, kept under lock and key by forces that wish to maintain their dominance. And yet, even as this knowledge is buried, it is not gone. It is still present, embedded in the very fabric of society, more sophisticated and concealed than ever before. The phenomenon of suppressing spiritual wisdom about death is not a thing of the past. It is something that continues to this very day. The truth about death, the very process that controls how we live, how we die, and what happens after, is not as distant as we might think. It has been shrouded in mystery, cloaked in fear, and woven into the deepest corners of human culture. But the solution, the key to unlocking this mystery, is not only in the distant past. It is within reach in the present day, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those who dare to look beyond the veil of conventional thinking. The knowledge of death, far from being lost, is actively kept from us because once we understand its true nature, we become free. Free from the systems that seek to control us, free from the fear that holds us prisoner. Imagine for a moment, what if the fear of death, the greatest fear of all, was never natural? What if the fear of death itself was an artificial construct created for the sole purpose of maintaining control over the masses? For centuries, humans have been taught to dread death, to believe it is an insurmountable mystery, a void that swallows all meaning. We have been conditioned to view it as the final judgment, the last and greatest terror. But what if this dread, this terror, was never a natural response to the unknown? What if it was carefully cultivated, crafted, and perpetuated by those in power to keep us in line, to make us afraid, to ensure that we would obey without question? The more we examine the history of this idea, the more it becomes apparent that this fear is not an inherent part of human nature. It has been imposed upon us. The fear of death is not a biological instinct. It is a psychological weapon, a tool of control. The ancient texts, the sacred teachings, and the mystical traditions all point to one central truth. The true nature of death has been obscured, and the reason for this obscuration is simple. Those who control the narrative about death control everything. They control our behavior, our beliefs, our choices, and ultimately our freedom. Let us delve into this further. Consider, for example, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a text that describes the soul's journey after death. According to this ancient scripture, the soul passes through the Bardo, a transitional state between life and death. During this period, the soul encounters various visions, some terrifying, some comforting. But the key point here is that these visions are not external forces. They are projections of the soul's own consciousness. The soul's experience after death is shaped by its own beliefs, its own fears, and its own awareness. In other words, the soul is not encountering an external reality, but rather a reflection of its own inner state. When the soul is filled with fear, it becomes trapped, unable to transcend the cycle of reincarnation. Fear, according to the Tibetan teachings, is what binds the soul to the material world, preventing it from achieving true liberation. This is not a concept unique to Tibetan Buddhism. Nearly every mystical tradition speaks of a similar experience after death. The Gnostics, for instance, warned of false lights, beings that appear to souls after death, masquerading as divine guides. But these beings have one objective: to draw the soul back into the cycle of reincarnation. The Egyptians, too, had their own set of teachings about death and rebirth. They spoke of the need for secret knowledge, specific words, and sacred rites in order to avoid being reincarnated. To the Egyptians, death was not an end, but a choice that could either lead to liberation or to further entrapment in the physical world. All of these teachings, from the East to the West, converge on the same central idea. Death is not a mystery to be feared, but a transition to a higher state of being. It is a moment of choice, but only for those who are aware of it. The key to transcending the cycle of life and death, to breaking free from the illusion of separation and suffering, lies in consciousness, specifically in the ability to remain conscious in the face of death. This is why fear is such a potent force. When we are afraid, we lose our ability to think clearly, to act with wisdom, to make the choices that could free us. Fear clouds our judgment, binds us to the material world, and keeps us trapped in the cycle of suffering. But now, let us ask a deeper question. What would happen if we stopped fearing death? What would happen if we truly understood that death is not an enemy, but a passage? Imagine a world in which people were no longer afraid of sickness, aging, or death. What if people stopped clinging to the false promises of safety and security that are offered by religions, governments, and institutions? Imagine a society in which people no longer lived in constant fear of what might happen tomorrow, a society in which the fear of death no longer influenced every aspect of human behavior. In such a world, the entire structure of control would collapse. Religions that capitalize on the fear of eternal damnation and punishment would lose their grip on the masses. The medical industry, built on the fear of aging, disease, and death, would no longer be able to manipulate people into buying products and services that promise to stave off the inevitable. Governments that rely on fear to maintain order would lose their power to control the populace. The social structures that have kept humanity in a state of fear, obedience, and servitude for centuries would begin to unravel. But why is this information kept hidden? Why has the true nature of death been so systematically suppressed? The answer is simple. Because once people stop fearing death, they stop needing the structures of control. The systems that have relied on fear as their greatest tool would crumble. Once the fear of death is eradicated, the greatest weapon of tyranny is disarmed, and that more than anything is what they fear most. The knowledge that death is not to be feared, that it is simply a passage to a higher state of being, has been hidden for centuries. The wisdom of the ancients, scattered across sacred texts and mystic teachings, holds the key to unlocking this truth. This knowledge was not lost. It was stolen. It was concealed, encoded in symbols and rituals, passed down only to a select few. From the mystery schools of Egypt to the esoteric traditions of the East, this knowledge has been guarded by those who understand its power. But now, it is time for this knowledge to be revealed. The moment humanity understands that death is not to be feared, the entire structure of control collapses. People will no longer be manipulated by fear. They will no longer be enslaved by the illusions of safety, security, and comfort. They will begin to live freely, with the full realization that the true nature of life and death lies within them, not in external structures or authorities. This is where the forbidden knowledge comes in. You are invited to join Insights Academy, where we reveal the truths that have been hidden from the general public for centuries. This information has the power to set you free from the shackles of fear and ignorance. For a limited time, we are offering access to the Kybalion, a sacred text that contains profound wisdom about life, death, and the nature of existence. But act quickly, because once you gain access to this knowledge, you will understand something far deeper, something that has been concealed from you for as long as humanity has existed. As you begin to explore this knowledge, you will see that it has always been there, hidden in plain sight. It was never lost. It was simply concealed, scattered across different cultures and civilizations, encoded in the sacred texts of the ancients. And now, you have the opportunity to unlock these truths for yourself. The moment you begin to understand the true nature of death, you will realize that the power to transcend it has always been within you. This knowledge is the key to liberation. It is the key to breaking free from the systems of control that have kept humanity in a state of fear and servitude for millennia. Why has this information been suppressed? Because the moment we truly understand the nature of death, we understand the nature of life itself. We realize that we are not separate from the universe, but one with it. We understand that we are eternal beings, not bound by the limitations of the material world. And when we realize this, we become untouchable. We become free.